Hi, this is Tom Santos from General Mills Flour. This is lesson 3 on how to be a flour detective. Today I'm going to talk about the function of sugar, salt, and oil in dough. Now I'm going to talk about salt first because in order to make any dough, you need four ingredients. You need salt, water, yeast, and flour. That'll make a dough. The optional ingredients are sugar and oil, though a number of pizzerias use sugar and oil. But I want to talk about salt first. Its function in dough, in making a dough, is fermentation control. Obviously, flavor. If you ever had a dough without salt in it, there's just no flavor to it, very bland dough. So, putting that aside, and obviously we need salt for the flavor, but it strengthens the gluten network. That's another thing. But the fermentation control is really one of the bigger things that salt does in the dough. What the salt does, it tells the yeast, slow down. Don't eat all the carbohydrates or all the sugars in the dough. It sort of tempers the yeast. The correct amount of salt in correspondence to the sugar really makes a dough have that nice slow fermentation. If you have, and especially a lot of the Neapolitan style doughs that you would make out of a flour like the Pre-Mardine, the salt, the only sugars in that type of dough, because you don't add sugar to those Neapolitan type doughs, would be the carbohydrates within the flour. And the salt really needs to regulate the amount of carbohydrates that the yeast eats in order to have proper fermentation. So salt, very important to dough conditioning and making the dough. Now let me talk about sugar. Sugar, yeast has one really purpose in life. It's to eat sugar and carbohydrates. So sugar is food for the yeast. Sugar also very important in the caramelization of the crust browning, and it has some effect on the keeping quality of the dough once it's baked. If there's too much sugar and not enough salt, what happens is the yeast will rifle through that sugar, eat all the sugar, and then go to the carbohydrates. Once it eats the carbohydrates and you try to bake that pizza, you can keep it in the oven a long time. You're not going to get any caramelization because there's nothing left to caramelize because all the sugars and the carbohydrates have been eaten by the yeast, and the yeast will then die. A lot of times you'll see when the yeast goes through sugar, and customers will say, "Well, geez, I look at the bottom of my dough ball and there's little brown or black specks on it." That's essentially telling them the yeast has died. What happens is the ash of the dough forms those little specks, and it's just a signal that the yeast went through all the sugar. So it's not anything in the dough that's just naturally occurring. Remember, sugar is controlled by salt. Think yin and yang of sugar and salt. Those are the functions. Salt controls sugar. You want to temper the yeast by using salt to slow down the yeast using all the sugar. And a good balanced formula, you'll have a nice rising dough. The last thing I'll talk about is oil and shortening. Some people use shortening, some people use lard, some people use straight oil, olive oil, a number of different things in oil, different types of oil. It gives a lubrication to the dough. It helps with the extendability of the dough a little bit, not much, a little bit of browning effect, but it's a tenderness. It gives it a tenderness and keeping quality, which is sort of important. I'm talking after the bake. If you have a customer who has the heat lamps or selling slices and keeping them warm with the heat lamps, they really should be using oil in their dough because those heat lamps are really tough on a baked product. The oil will keep some of that tenderness to the dough. And that's something, as a flour detective, if you go in and they're not using oil and they have a heat lamp, their dough is going to really dry out quickly. So oil shortening, that's the function in dough, mainly the extendability and some tenderness and a little bit of keeping quality. The usage could run, depending on the type I'm talking baker's percents, and we could get into that on a future flour detective. But usually you could go from 0 to probably 10, 12% on oil, Soft, you're about 1 to 2.5%. And the sugar, you could be 1 to 5% in that area, 0 to 5% if you're using zero being a Neapolitan dough. I know I went through there quick. If you have any questions, give me a call or shoot me an email, tom.santos@genmills.com. Look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks.